Okay, are we off? We're ready?
Yep.
Hello, and welcome to episode 2 of the Liverpool Stories podcast with me, Dale Roberts. Before I begin this podcast, the last episode, the first episode of the Liverpool Stories podcast went better than I ever could have imagined. The response to it's been quite overwhelming, and I've been incredibly proud of it. It's also resulted in me getting over 130 subscribers on the YouTube channel. So if you can, subscribe on YouTube, engage, let me know what you think of the episodes, comment, tell me what you'd like to see more of in the city as well. And this subject that I'm going to talk about on this podcast, it should generate a little bit of conversation, but get in touch. It's really nice, and I want to continue doing this, and the real goal by the end of 2025 is to be up towards the 4-figure mark when it comes to subscribers on the channel. But with that out of the way, this episode is going to be entitled The Place Where It All Began. And The Place Where It All Began is also going to be a series that I'm wanting to do on this podcast. You see, when I set up this podcast, now the whole concept of it, it was before I became part owner of the George Harrison House in Liverpool. The George Harrison House means it's a great place to interview guests. I can get people on the podcast and we can have conversations about Liverpool and people can tell their stories. But for me, I'm a storyteller by trade, and something I'm infatuated with in many ways is the idea of where did this cultural phenomenon of the Beatles all begin. And it's something that kind of became more of a discussion last year as well in Liverpool, because once again we had a blue plaque unveiled outside a great place in Liverpool called the Jacaranda, and the plaque says it's the place where the Beatles played first using the name The Beatles, the Jacaranda. But there's many contenders for this title of The Place Where It All Began. And by the way, I know this might not sound like the best way to start an episode. It should be a good way to hype everything up. But it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things anyway. But in 1964, the Beatles played on the Ed Sullivan Show to over 73 million people live. And that sparked a cultural phenomenon that would completely change the world. It defined the 1960s. It would transform the world of music. And straight away, a man in Liverpool called Ray McFall, a man who we owe it all to, he put up a massive big sign outside his venue saying, "The Place Where It All Began." And that place was the Cavern. So this podcast today is dedicated to the place where the slogan first began, the place where it all began, which is the Cavern Club in Liverpool. But when Ray McFall put that sign up outside his venue, of course, over the years, there'd be many other contenders that would come into question as the place where it truly all began for the Beatles. And then people debate, when did it all begin for the Beatles? Because if it began, say, for instance, in Hamburg in Germany, then it was John, Paul, George, Stuart Sutcliffe and Pete Best in the band at that point. So this isn't the lineup of John, Paul, George and Ringo. The first time the Beatles ever made a recording was in Percy Phillips' studio in Kensington. And that was John, Paul, George, Colin Hanton and John Duff Lowe. So you've got a whole story behind the real origins of the Beatles. And that's what I want to do in this podcast. I want to tell that story, explore the idea of the place where it all began. Okay, so this is Mathew Street. Full disclaimer before I begin. I work for the Cavern Club. So I've worked for the Cavern Club for the past 7 or 8 years now. So one of the proudest things for me was in 2018, Bill Heckle, who owns the Cavern Club, pulled me into a meeting and told me that they were setting up tours of the Cavern Club, and he asked me to be the tour guide. To this very day, I'm the only person to actually do scheduled tours of the Cavern Club. The only other people who've done it is directors of the Cavern Club, and they've only done it on one-off occasions. So for me, I've took people around Mathew Street for years talking about its history. So before people jump in comments and start saying that it's biased, I want to let people know the Cavern's got a long, confusing, turbulent history. Mathew Street has as well. And for me, it's been my job now for years to make sure that I am exact on its history. So feel free to comment. If I miss things out, which is highly likely, if I don't get dates perfect, that might happen. but Mathew Street's got a complex history. In fact, just so we can really break down its history in full detail, we're going to go really far back. Originally, this was a dirt alley, okay? And eventually it'd be owned by a gentleman called Matthew Pluckington. He'd own this patch of land, and what he would do is he'd start getting warehouses built on it. Eventually it'd be called Pluckington Alley. That was its original name, Pluckington Alley in Liverpool, but eventually they changed it to Mathew Street. That's why people get confused when they Google Mathew Street. Some got one T, because that's how he spelt his name. But over the years, Mathew Street would become more and more built up, and the reason why is because it was in close proximity to the docks of Liverpool. So you would have people transporting goods here to be stored in the warehouses close to the city centre. So even when we look across Mathew Street these days, you can see it's old warehouses for the most part. You know, as we travel, things have changed over the years. Of course they have. So the first thing you see of major significance on Mathew Street is here. This is our John Lennon statue. It's one of the most photographed statues in Liverpool, just so you know. It's permanent, normally queues day and night, taking pictures. Situated right next to the Caverns Wall of Fame. The Wall of Fame is supposed to list anyone who's played the Cavern from 1957 till 1973. That's supposed to be what it is, but when you look at it, you'll notice names like Adele, Oasis, but you'll also notice many names from the past. You'll notice Queen. Queen played the Cavern on the 31st of October 1970. One of the first gigs using their band name Queen was at the Cavern Club. It's one of the first few gigs that they played using their band name Queen. There's loads of Queen history in Liverpool that normally takes people by surprise as well. But you'll notice other names like the Beatles, you'll notice Oasis, John, Paul, George, Ringo, and Pete, all individually listed. But that is supposed to list everyone of note who's played the Cavern over the years. One of the biggest sources of confusion with the Cavern's history is the Cavern Pub, which is just here. The Cavern Pub is not where the Beatles played. The Beatles never played the Cavern Pub. It was basically an overthrow stage set up by Cavern City Tours in the 1990s. They set it up just simply so they could have more live music. What's happening, Tony, mate? Yeah. Here, Liverpool is now twinned with Memphis. I'm very proud to say I was here at the unveiling of this first little plaque at the bottom when the mayor of Memphis came to Liverpool, alongside the mayor of Liverpool at the time, to unveil this plaque. We're a twin city with Memphis, which I love. One thing that people tend to miss when they come to Mathew Street, because Mathew Street, this is incredibly quiet because we're here in the morning time. But when people tend to come to Mathew Street, it's thriving, it's hustle and bustle. There's thousands of people sometimes on the street in an August day, you know. But they don't tend to look at every detail. And this is one of my favourite details on Mathew Street, which is Liverpool's Wall of Fame. You see, when we talk about the place where it all began, it's Liverpool where it begins. In fact, even when we consider Memphis and the history of Memphis and rock and roll, we can even take it further back in terms of its origins, which I will do in further videos. And it all comes back to Liverpool at its starting location, and I love that about the city. But this is Liverpool's Wall of Fame. We're a UNESCO City of Music. The Guinness Book of Records even called Liverpool the world capital of popular music, with 58 number one hit singles, going all the way from Lita Rosa with How Much Is That Doggy in the Window, the UK's first female number one, to the Beatles' most recent number one, which is Now and Then. So 58 number one hit singles. We have the Liverpool Wall of Fame, which lists all of them, yeah, in front of what is the Cavern Club's restaurants, which only opened, I believe, 6 or 7 years ago at this point. It's a beautiful little restaurant. Okay, when we talk about where it all began, there was a place where it all began for the Cavern Club, and it wasn't actually in Liverpool. In 1956, so before the Cavern Club even opens, Alan Sittner sits in the Grapes pub on Mathew Street, which at the time was the only place that sold alcohol on Mathew Street itself. He sat with his friend having a drink, and he spoke to his friend all about a trip he just had to Paris, to a little club called Les Caverns de la Hugette, and he'd fell in love with this jazz club in Paris. And he came back and was chatting to his friend and said, I want to open up my own Les Caverns in Liverpool, and I want it to be the best jazz club outside of London. And I'll be honest with you, that we've all had these ideas after a few drinks. In fact, even me getting George Harrison's house and recently becoming the part owner of it, I was sat in the Grapes pub with a friend of mine, and that's kind of where I was like, go on, let's do it, you know? So I like that. It's part of the origin story, but Alan Sittner actually followed through with the plan. He finished having his drink with his friend, came out of the Grapes, and he walked further up Mathew Street. And as he was walking up Mathew Street, he got to number 10 Mathew Street, and there was a sign up saying that it was for lease. So he arranged the view and he went in, fell in love with the place. And that was the origins of the Cavern Club. 16th of January 1957, Alan Sittner held the opening night of the Cavern Club. It was estimated that well over 500 people queued up to get in, which really is quite something. But Alan Sittner had said that the Earl of Warncliffe was coming for the opening. That seemed to attract a lot of people. So there was over 500 people queued down Mathew Street to go into the Cavern Club on its opening night. But we have to remember when the Cavern Club was first opening, it was a strict jazz and skiffle venue. It wasn't a rock and roll venue. So the kids were not queuing up to listen to rock and roll. They were queuing up to listen to jazz music at that time on a cold January daytime, you know. Of course, Alan Sittner would set up the Cavern Club. It would become a very successful jazz and skiffle venue. The Quarrymen would play the Cavern in its early days, but they get banned from playing here. In fact, Alan Sittner famously would pass up notes to John Lennon when he was on stage playing Hound Dog saying, "Cut out that bloody rock and roll." So the Quarrymen were not really welcome at the Cavern Club because they were a skiffle band, but they were only playing skiffle so they could replicate rock and roll. You see, skiffle was becoming a very popular form of music in the UK in the 1950s. They would estimate that there'd be over 30,000 skiffle bands in this country. Lots of them were found here on Merseyside because we were directly connected with the United States of America through the port, and the kids were taken to skiffle to replicate rock and roll. Now, eventually these skiffle bands would form decent rock and roll bands, and they'd start playing at the Cavern Club. It was uncontrollable for Alan. So what would happen here is Ray McFall would become the owner of the Cavern. Now, we owe everything to Ray McFall, because Ray McFall embraced rock and roll here at the Cavern Club. He started employing bands like Jerry and the Pacemakers and the Searchers, and Cilla Black was the cloakroom girl on the door of the Cavern Club famously. She collected the coats on the door and would eventually go on to be the most successful female vocalist of the 1960s in this country. Originally collected the coats on the door. She'd eventually get up on stage with many of the bands, become a great female vocalist, of course, and a household name forevermore. But it was in 1961. By this point, Bill Harry had set up a magazine in Liverpool called the Merseybeat magazine. The Merseybeat was popularising all these Liverpool bands, and the Cavern Club was really becoming a central hub of the Merseybeat. So, in 1961, with rock and roll becoming so popular, Ray McFall decided to open up the Cavern at lunchtime for lunchtime rock and roll sessions. So we got a new band, fresh out of Hamburg, and this band went on to play the Cavern 292 times over a period of time which spanned less than 2.5 years. What's happened, Billy? You okay, mate? Sure, mate. The Cavern Club became like the Beatles' basement cellar, you know. Kids were coming here, queues up and down the street to go and see the Beatles play the Cavern. It was the central hub of the Merseybeat. It became a real musical movement that would legitimately go on to completely change the world, because this musical movement, the Merseybeat, laid the foundations for the British invasion period of pop, which changed everything and defined the 1960s. You know, British bands led by the Merseybeat, led by the Beatles, dominating the US pop charts, and it changes the world. But when that musical movement was traced back to its source, of course it ended up back here on Mathew Street, and it ended up back at the Cavern Club itself. So when people got wind that on the 9th of November 1961, Brian Epstein had discovered the Beatles in this basement cellar, everybody wants to play the Cavern. And when I say everyone, I mean Chuck Berry, Stevie Wonder, Elton John, Eric Clapton, the Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Who, Queen, Jimi Hendrix. The list of greats who played the Cavern goes on and on and on and on. The problem with the Cavern Club was it was a warehouse basement cellar. One way in, one way out. No fire exits, no working toilets. Yeah. The Cavern Club stunk, apparently. It had its own famous and iconic smell of smoke, stale fruit, toilet disinfectant, and sweat. In fact, famously, when the Beatles played their final gig in the Cavern Club, the sweat visibly dripped down the walls, blew all the electrics, and left everyone in pitch black darkness in the Cavern Club. This isn't a safe venue. So they know the issues. Ray McFall already knew the issues at the heights of Beatlemania. Ray McFall had already got plans together to expand the Cavern Club, to buy the warehouses on either side, make the Cavern Club bigger. But Ray McFall would never see those plans through. At the start of 1966, Ray McFall would unfortunately go bankrupt. You see, the Beatles had left the Cavern. The Merseybeat scene had moved on. The kids had grown up. The Cavern Club was already falling into financial hardships, and then they were expanding. So In early 1966, Ray went bankrupt and the Cavern Club was sold to Alf Geegan and Joe Davy. Okay? They started to go through with that expansion. By the summer of 1966, Harold Wilson, the country's Prime Minister, came to Mathew Street to reopen the cavern. But when he reopened the cavern, it was 3 times the size. It'd grown, become bigger. Everyone went in and was unfortunately upset because it changed far too much. They felt it now had a bar, they were selling alcohol inside the cavern, and also it lost its famous and iconic smell, which genuinely upset people. They felt it was too sanitised, they felt it was too professional. They stopped going to the cavern. From 1966 onwards, the Cavern Club unfortunately lost a lot of its popularity. It started falling into financial hardships once again. So eventually, again, the Cavern Club would be finally passed on to a new owner called Roy Adams. Now, for many years, Liverpool City Council has bore the weight of responsibility for allowing the Cavern Club to be demolished. It wasn't the case. It was actually a very complex thing that coincided with the Cavern Club losing all of its popularity, the Beatles breaking up, and the kids just growing up in general. Roy Adams was unfortunately told that British Rail had placed a compulsory purchase order on number 8 to 12 Mathew Street. They needed to build a ventilation shaft for the city's underground railway loop. And Roy Adams was told, we can build it elsewhere, but you have to pay for the plans. So it was about £500 in those days that Roy Adams was told that he would have to pay to prevent the demolition of the Cavern Club. The Cavern Club was already in financial difficulties and it was struggling. So Roy Adams decided it was best that the Cavern moved. The Cavern Club in 1973 was shut down, seemingly for good. They started demolishing the buildings on ground level. They filled the cavern itself full of its own rubble, while in the meantime, the cavern moved to the other side of the road. In name only. They moved the cavern to the other side of the street. It was known as the Cavern for 3 years until eventually it changed the name to Revolution. After Revolution, it changed the name to Eric's, and Eric's became a legendary venue for the punks of Liverpool. Many greats played in Eric's. Frankie Goes to Hollywood, Dead or Alive, A Flock of Seagulls. A Flock of Seagulls actually didn't play Eric's, but they got their band name from a drunken night out in Eric's, which I think is better than playing the venue. But it wasn't the Cavern, and people knew it. Eric's became legendary in and of its own right. It was at the forefront of the punk movement. But on the other side of Mathew Street was a bare patch of land where people were parking their cars. In 1980, a local architect by the name of David Backhouse embarked upon a multi-million-pound project to excavate the original site of the Cavern Club, and that's what happened. They started excavating the original site. They discovered its foundations weren't stable enough to simply reopen the cavern in its same state, so they rebuilt the cavern. The Cavern Club these days would claim that it's on 70% of its original footprint. It was built with 15,000 of its original bricks. But most importantly, when they reopened it, it was back on number 10 Mathew Street. To be specific with its changes, it has changed over the years. It's slightly further underground. It's been shifted 90 degrees to the side as well. These days it's got fire exits, working toilets, a functioning bar, ventilation, air conditioning. It's even got Wi-Fi. Didn't have Wi-Fi in the original cavern, of course. When the Cavern Club reopened in 1984, Tommy Smith was the new owner of the Cavern Club, Liverpool FC legend. One of the issues that they had is when they reopened the cavern, they moved its entrance up the street, further adding to the confusion of the Cavern Club's history. They moved its entrance from where it was in those early days when the Beatles went into it. They moved that in 1966. As part of the expansion, they moved the cavern's entrance up the street. And then when they rebuilt the cavern, they put the entrance in the same location that it was in 1966. So if you've ever heard anyone talking about the Cavern Club's history and they say, no, it was actually further down the street, the entrance was. But the Cavern Club, if you go into its original entrance these days, you end up back in the exact same location, right next to the stage of the Cavern Club itself. If you ever heard people saying that the Cavern's a car park, again, that's because people park their cars on the bare patch of land. If you've ever heard people saying the Cavern's on the other side of the road, it was for 3 years. Okay? But let's go into the Cavern Club in these days, its modern state, but in a state that has existed longer than it ever did in its original format. So, this is the Liverpool Stories podcast by me, Dale Roberts. So far, it should be no surprise whatsoever, there's no sponsors of this podcast. However, right now, I sponsor this and fully fund it myself. I have my own company, which is Dale Liverpool Tours Limited, and we have Liverpool Eco Tours as the trading name of it. And I do a variety of different tours, including a walking Beatles tour. And as part of it, it acts as a pub crawl tour. we come to Mathew Street, we go towards places like the Cavern Club, we'll visit places like the Grapes, the Jacaranda, Yeet Crack. We visit loads of these places that were so instrumental in the story of how it all began for the Beatles. So the reason why I'm saying this is throughout the entire winter, I will be running tours every Monday night that people can just book onto. If you want to privately book a tour on any other day or night of the week, feel free to get in touch with me. I do a variety of different tours here in the city of Liverpool. Okay, so the most important date in the Cavern Club's history was the 9th of November, 1961. Brian Epstein, a man who owned a record shop around the corner from the Cavern Club, he'd heard about the Beatles. A young lad called Raymond Jones came into his shop, asked for a copy of My Bonnie by Tony Sheridan and the Beat Brothers, a record that they'd made while they were in Hamburg. Brian ordered in 50 copies, they sold out straight away, and then he was curious. Who on earth are the Beatles? He was told the Beat Brothers, the Beatles, played in the Cavern Club most lunchtimes. So 9th of November 1961, Brian Epstein made his trip up Mathew Street. He entered into this location just here, the original entrance of the Cavern Club. He walked in and he discovered the Beatles playing on stage, fell in love with them, and he became their manager. 9th of November 1961, he discovers them. And by the 9th of February 1964, they are playing on the Ed Sullivan Show in the United States of America to over 73 million people live. And the world is never, ever the same again. It was because Brian Epstein discovered them in the Cavern Club on the 9th of November 1961. So the Cavern Club has changed over the years. It's been demolished, rebuilt with the same materials, rebuilt in the exact same location. And one of the things that always confuses people is people assume it's further down the road or on the other side of the street, or that it's now a car park. And then they come to Mathew Street and they discover that there's a doorway which says you are here at the original entrance of the Cavern Club. And it's further down from where the Cavern Club's actual entrance is. If you enter into the original entrance of the Cavern Club, which is now a fire exit, it takes you into the Cavern Club itself. So today we have special permission from the Cavern Club that we can go into the fire exit. So we can go into the original entrance location of the Cavern. This is the place where the Beatles entered 292 times, where Brian Epstein walked in. And we can go in and we can see that when we get down to the bottom, we enter exactly into where the Cavern Club is to this very day. So is the Cavern the original Cavern? No, but it is built with the same materials, same bricks, and it's in the exact same location. Follow me into the original entrance of the Cavern Club. She loves you, she loves you, she loves you, don't make it back, take a sad song and make it better. So, the Cavern Club reopens in 1984, and Tommy Smith becomes the new owner of the Cavern Club, a Liverpool FC football legend and icon. And they reopen the Cavern. All the old stars come back and they sign the back wall of the Cavern. Everything's very exciting. But you need to understand that Liverpool in the 80s was a completely different place than it is now. In 1984, the Cavern Club was rebuilt, reopened in the exact same location. It can't open in the same way as it ever was. Everyone always has to remember this. The original Cavern could not exist in today's day and age. It was an unsafe venue. It was no fire exits, no ventilation, no safe electricity. It couldn't exist in today's day and age. So the Cavern had to change. But the city had changed. The city had already started to change by the mid-1960s. By the 70s, it was completely different as well. But then by the 80s, Liverpool goes into mass industrial decline. 80% youth unemployment plagues our city. In 1981, riots break out in an area of Liverpool called Toxteth that started to define the political landscape because they are blamed for inciting riots throughout the rest of the country. Liverpool's a different place. And so Tommy Smith, a Liverpool FC football legend, is the new owner of the Cavern, and it's been rebuilt. And it doesn't seem to work at first. They couldn't get it right. The Cavern Club bounces across its ownership throughout the 1980s, and it looks like it's a failed project. Things aren't going too well for the Cavern Club. But in the 1990s, a company took over the Cavern Club called Cavern City Tours, and this really ushers in the new era of the Cavern. Cavern City Tours are still the longest serving owners in the Cavern Club's entire history, and by far the most successful. Cavern City Tours become the new owners of the Cavern Club, and they start putting live music on the stage. They put music back at the heart of it, because in the 80s, Liverpool wasn't attracting tourists into the city. Of course they weren't. People had a negative stereotype of the city. So when Cavern City Tours start bringing in music again and putting music at the forefront, and live music in particular, rather than having discos, things start to change and things start to take shape. The real moment, though, that the Cavern really starts to change in its modern era is in 1999. Paul McCartney comes back and he plays on this stage of the Cavern Club. This is one of the most watched events in the world at the time, because they live streamed it on the internet. It broke all the live streaming records in 1999 because live streaming wasn't exactly popular at that point. And then Paul came back a few years later. He had a private party in the Cavern Club. So again, it starts giving credit to this new era of the Cavern's history. So by the 1990s as well, Ringo comes back to the Cavern Club. Ringo comes back and he's filming a show for the Disney Channel, and he signs the back wall of the Cavern Club. Ringo comes back, Paul's been back, and all of a sudden you're getting an influx of rock and roll stars who are wanting to come and play to Cavern Club in its modern era. Even not rock and roll stars, but pop stars in general. You have Adele launching a Grammy Award-winning album, 21, from the stage of the Cavern, an album that goes on to become Album of the Decade at the Grammy Awards. Oasis play the Cavern, Travis, loads of these great Britpop bands start playing the Cavern as well. So all of a sudden you have Mathew Street not only at the forefront of the Merseybeat movement, which lays the foundations for the British invasion period of pop, and it's not only at the forefront of the punk revolution with Eric's, but you also then have a sort of new emergence of the Britpop era. In today's day and age, the Cavern Club's a thriving tourist venue. Hundreds of thousands of people come here every single year, and it's still known as the most famous club in the world. Has it changed? Of course it's changed. The original Cavern could not exist in today's day and age. So we have the Cavern, the same bricks, same materials, still in the same address, and still attracting international artists of note to this very day. So the whole point of this podcast is kind of discovering the places where it all began. It began here. The Merseybeat scene was flourishing here. It began for the Beatles and their relationship with Brian Epstein here at the Cavern Club. The world starts to change, and it's from the back alleys of Liverpool, Mathew Street. Okay, so that marks the end of this podcast episode number 2 of the Liverpool Stories podcast. Now, this has only touched the surface of the history of the Cavern Club and of Mathew Street in general. As I said during the little advert midway through this podcast, if you want to know more, get on a tour with me and I'll tell you all about the history of the Cavern. You can ask as many questions as you want, but you can also ask questions in the comments, send me a message in general, and if you want to find out more about the Cavern, of course, come along and visit Liverpool yourself.